Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Karl Marx spoke 8 languages. He learned calculus and algebra to support his exploration of economics. With his friend Engels, he wrote over 4,000 letters to fellow academics. Most of his notes and manuscripts remained unpublished. The last decade of Marx has recently drawn attention as a synthesis of his remarkable contributions to our political discourse, still relevant today. Let's discuss this with a Marx scholar. Well, warm greetings, everybody. We are joined today with Greg on the East Coast and Carlos Garrido in the Midwest, and I'm on the West Coast, and we're discussing Karl Marx. And I would say that Carlos, you certainly would be considered a scholar of Marx in your work at SIU. Is that correct?
Yeah. Marx and Hegel have been my central focus. And of course, more specifically, when I talk about Marx, it's been the Marxist-Leninist tradition, which is not too often found in academic Marxism anymore. But I engage with the Western Marxist stuff as well.
Well, Greg and I pass books back and forth, and one book that we discovered from your review, by the way, which is a fascinating review in March of this year, is The Last Years of Karl Marx. And I thought that, we've discussed it and we went back and forth, and we thought, well, why don't we have a Marx expert on that could discuss Musto's fabulous book of the recently discovered last decade of Marx. Tell me a little bit about your observations about that book.
Well, it covers one of the most unexamined periods of Marx's life. I have a few of the old Soviet biographies, and what you find is that towards those last 10 years, specifically after Capital, more so, it's primarily very abstract the way that the biographies go. There's not too much stuff being said on it. It's primarily manuscript, so it's treated as if no serious work comes about, and in a sense, there's no serious publication that takes place after that. But when you look at the notes that he was taking, the ridiculous amount of reading that he was doing in all sorts of fields, in mathematics and different sciences and anthropology and history, of course, in economics. There's fascinating stuff, and this research that Musto's book deals with that. He deals with various topics. I think that probably by far the most important one is the studies on anthropology and his analysis of the Russian Obshchina, which means the rural commune that existed in Russia. And this work has been primarily revived in Latin America, specifically in Bolivia, because they see that the way that Marx concretely analyzed these certain forms of life and just was very hesitant to accept the way that people, some of them calling themselves Marxists, would just take the sort of historical schema that he provided for Western Europe and just apply it somewhere else. He was very hesitant to do that and very critical of that. So the developments that take place towards the end of Marx's life are both very unknown in the West, which is the importance of this book in English, but also very important specifically for the recent developments in Latin American socialist projects.
In reading this book, Marx was really a brilliant fellow, an intellect that was remarkable. He learned 8 languages. He taught himself Russian because he wanted to know more about the communes in Russia and the regions.
In 1869, so just think of how old he was in 1869. You usually hear that after being 30, it's basically impossible to learn a language.
He suffered horribly from lung problems, personal problems, losing his wife, losing his daughter. So the emotional issues that were reflected in this last decade were prominent. And yet he did things like, I'm going to teach myself algebra and differential calculus because I want to make sure that my work on capital is the math is correct. You know, he studied mathematics, taught himself that, anthropology, mineralogy, all of those issues were in the last decade. Just he was prominent with that.
Yeah. So he starts studying math in the time that he's writing the 7 notebooks that we now know as the Grandries. So 57 and 59, 1857 and 1859. And he notices that he makes certain mistakes in just like basic algebraic math. So he very unwillingly, but with math, and after a few years pass, he's like driving Engels crazy in his letters because he keeps talking about math, and he sends Engels this big manuscript. And it's interesting because the letters from Paul Lafargue, who is his Cuban son-in-law, and I say that very proudly because I'm Cuban as well, but his Cuban son-in-law, he says that when Marx was in the darkest emotional places of his life, and he would do math, which um, I think most people would find quite
Right,
strange. But
right.
like you said, there was a lot of emotional suffering towards that latter part of his life. He has the death of his wife, who, I mean, he knew since basically his whole life, and who he married quite young. He had the death of his first daughter, Jenny Chen, Jenny Caroline. He used to call her Jenny Chen. He had to deal with his other daughter. She would end up killing herself uh, later on in 1898. So there was a lot of emotional damage, and then just physical pain. He was someone who was sick most of his life with a skin problem, but towards the end he develops a lung disease, which is quite brutal and takes him away from his work for substantial periods of time. And one of the things that you get in Musto's biography is how doctors were trying to deal with this. They were just sending him all over the place to try to find climates that would help. In part, those last 72 days those 72 days he spends in Algeria, which is the only time he leaves Europe ever in his life. Um, he went there unwillingly, but he ended up convincing himself that if he was able to get better, maybe he could finish Capital. And he's talking about Capital Volume 1. He
Right,
kept on
right.
perfecting it, right? He wanted to get a third German edition out there. Um, so I think the the difficulties that he was facing just in his everyday life are captured nicely by the last piece of writing that he did, which was a letter to his doctor, where he says that um, the sort of the emotional and mental pain is so bad that I kind of get when I get a headache, because it helps me move away from the, so like physical pain was helping him
Right.
move away from emotional pain.
And you were chatting about Marx's emotional and physical problems and how he moved to Algiers. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting. His observations in Algeria is a Muslim country, and he continued all through his life making observations and sort of revising some of his theories about different countries and his theories as they relate to that. Tell the story about him playing cards or seeing the card game with the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor, and how that what his thoughts were about that in Algeria.
Yes, so what's interesting is that, I mean, we're talking in a general context where the last part of his life is under examined. This trip is itself like the most under examined part of that last part of his life. He spends 72 days, which is a relatively long time in Algiers. And he sees a few things. One of the things that he sees is the despicable way that the French colonial police treats the people there. And he's very critical of it. he sees the way, the sort of what he calls the haughtiness of the European tourist who goes to Algeria on tourism, but they feel themselves as if they're a king or a prince or something. And he's very much disgusted by that. I saw a video recently, an older video of a couple upper class French women in Vietnam just tossing coins at Vietnamese kids. And that's the sort of stuff that he was kind of witnessing from the European tourists in Algiers. But it's interesting because he sees an event, the one you've asked me to describe, of a few Algerians playing cards, and he sees people that are well dressed and then people that are poorly dressed, and they're all interacting in like a very neutral way. And so he says something along the lines of like they embodied the fact that they were all children of Muhammad. And so that's an interesting observation because you don't generally see that in European civil society. You don't see workers or peasants interacting in a relatively equal manner with either the owning class or landlords or nobility. So that was something that impressed him very much. And there was also like these little amusing stories that he would hear that he would send back to either his daughter Laura or Engels. He sends around 19 letters at that time. But there's interesting social observations, and I think that one of the things that it confirms is something which I think shouldn't even be a question, which is some of the myths that are created from bourgeois academia, which in trying to sound radical, they have created this myth of like a Eurocentric Marx, and a Marx whose understanding of history legitimizes and justifies colonialism, right? Like a colonialism sympathizing Marx. And that's just not true at all, right? I mean, there's some letters early on, and some articles that Engels and that Engels does on the American expansion westward that are a little iffy, but the general his work that doesn't point towards any of that colonialism sympathizing worldview, and that's still something that is prevalent in academia, as you mentioned. I am right now in academia, so I hear the different strands of radicalism, and they all have this conception. And this time in Algiers kind of just shows from an everyday social level how that's not true at all. He was very critical of the French police, and very impressed with Muslim culture in Algeria.
You know, it's I was most impressed with the book because it humanized Marx, and of course that's really been bourgeois sources, bourgeois commentators, unfriendly folks to Marx have created a myth about him being a hard, callous human being. So I thought the great value of the book was in humanizing him, but it also shows his evolution, and that's often lost in the accounts of Western Marxists, quote unquote Marxists, who focus on the early Marx or this part of Marx or that part of Marx, and they fail to understand it. It's an evolving theory. It's an evolving position and approach. And he had an insatiable desire to learn and to expand what he was working on. And seemingly everything excited him. I mean, everything from laws of thermodynamics. I mean, anything that came up that was new or scientific fascinated Marx, and he tried to see how that fit into a unified worldview. But it was kind of an unfinished worldview, which it should be. But I give Musto great credit for focusing on that part of his life when perhaps he wasn't as productive in terms of books, in terms of what we know or remember from him, but to show how alive Marx still was. His sense of inquiry, of discovery was still there. So yeah, I thought you captured that well in your review, very well in the review.
Yeah. So one of the, I think that perhaps the clearest place that you see that in is in his analysis of the Russian commune, which is connected to his general anthropological studies, which, as I mentioned, besides in Latin American projects, has been something quite overlooked. You have in 1972 the publication of the ethnological notebooks of Marx, which is done by Lawrence Crater, who introduces it, and that contained some of his readings. Perhaps the most important one was the Lewis Henry Morgan Ancient Societies, which of course Engels publishes in 1884, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and Estate. And it's basically analyzing both Morgan's Ancient Society, and the notes that Marx had taken from Morgan. And that changes primarily Marx's, well, both of their views on the family. They had a fairly bourgeois notion of the family as the primary social unit, and they find in their studies that familias and familia both come from slave connotations. Familias was the name for the slave that a man owned in Rome, and then familia was the sort of lot of slaves that was owned by one man. And so they end up seeing through the studies of Lewis Henry Morgan that the family is sort of the ground for both slavery and serfdom, which is something quite a meaningful change in their view. It has been taken up, of course, by Marxist feminists quite a bit, but and there's also the confirmation of the state as a sort of transitory, quite new creation of human social relations, which again is a thesis that Marxists have had since basically 1843. That's confirmed in Lewis Henry Morgan's work, and but the implications of Crater's notebooks weren't they didn't explode. Like there wasn't much significance in the West given to them. The significance has primarily been given to them through Latin America, and specifically a notebook that Crater leaves out is the Maxim Kovalevsky notebooks. Kovalevsky was a Russian anthropologist. He was one of what Marx called his scientific friends. And he wrote a book called Communal Land Ownership. And in that text, he studies pre-Columbian societies, specifically the Aztecs and the Inca empires. And he also studies India. And the information that he finds is quite useful for Marx, but Marx ends up being critical of Kovalevsky's application of certain categories like peasantry or feudalism, or that he took from Marx's analysis of the stages that Europe had gone through, and he applied it to places that had completely different concrete conditions and histories. So why is that important? Why is that important? Well, the Marxists in Bolivia and in Latin America have found that part of interpreting the world correctly, which for us it means interpreting it concretely, historicizing the world, is that it gives you the best chance to apply the best methods in trying to change it, right? There's often the famous 11 Thesis is often misunderstood as just a sort of endorsement of blind practice, but that's not the case at all. When he says that philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. He's not saying we don't have to interpret the world, but the interpretation has to be grounded in and aimed at changing the world in a revolutionary manner. And so if you're misinterpreting the world by applying these categories from outside to different concrete conditions, to different historical developments, you are setting yourself 2 steps back in the changing of the world. And if you analyze classes incorrectly because you're calling them a class that was specific, you're calling like the the original primary communities that still exist in a few places in Latin America, if you're calling them like peasants, you're not understanding their concrete position in the mode of life and how capitalism has, the sort of mode of life that capitalism has created in its expansion there. And you're undermining perhaps the revolutionary potential that might be in that class. And he makes those statements with relationship to Kovalevsky, but they really concretize in his analysis of Russia. So as we mentioned, I don't know if it was before I froze, but as we mentioned, Marx begins to study Russian in 1869. And he does that because he's very interested in ground rents and Russian agrarian conditions in general. As a side note, the ground rent stuff has really just taken off. His studies of Justice von Liebig have really taken off in the last 20 or so years with the work of John Bellamy Foster into a Marxist ecology and the development of the theory of metabolism and metabolic rifts. But anyways, he's very interested in Russia and in the fight against Tsardom and in the role that the commune can play. And he finds himself very interested by the writings of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who was a left-wing socialist populist. And Chernyshevsky had a view that argued that once historical development took place in one area, its emergence in another area, that development's emergence in another area doesn't have to go through the same steps as it did in the first area because it already exists. It's almost a commonsensical point. If something's already developed in one place, its development in another, it's usually going to be a whole lot quicker. So he had a view that the parts, to use the more backward parts of the world, didn't have to go through all of the stages that Europe did to have the productive, the development in the forces of production that Europe had, that they can have that development in the forces of production while sustaining the sort of communal relations that still predominated certain regions of Russia. And he has this amusing quote where he says, history is like a grandmother. It's very fond of its youngest children. To the older ones, it gives the bone, and to the younger ones, the marrow, right? So Marx is very interested in Chernyshevsky. And
so to state another way,
yeah,
when you look at the development of a nation, they go through more primitive stages, and they go through a stair step. And he said that all of these nations don't have to, these quotes primitive nations don't have to go through all of these stages. They can learn from what has come before them. And that was a pretty radical thought change in a way. Is that am I saying that correctly?
Oh yeah. Well, if we think about it, so we have 500 years of capitalism, but before that we have feudalism, which it didn't have capitalist private property, but it had what Marx calls in Capital self-earned private property, right? Individualized private property. Before that, you have with Rome and with Greece, you have primarily slave economies, what are called now slave democracies. So you haven't had what you had in that moment in Russia, which is just a commune, a bunch of people living, bunch of the population living in basically communistic relations. You haven't had that for ages in Europe, right? It's not just capitalism. It's been a very long time since anything like that has been in Europe in general. Some places have had it, but so it'll be somewhat ridiculous to try to apply this stage theory that fits correctly, that results from a concrete dialectical materialist analysis of Europe, to fit that in another place that has completely different social relations, right? Now, capitalism is a system that necessarily expands. So Marx wasn't like saying, "Oh, capitalism is never going to touch these regions." He was very well aware that it was going to get there, and that it was, and very in a very embryonic manner already getting there. But the argument was, so let me first mention there's a famous letter that's a little bit more well known, that is sent by a Russian populist, Vera Sasulish. And she basically tells him, I think the quote is something like a life or death question, which is a little bit of pressure to put on Marx, but we have a life or death question for you. We have this sort of fork, which is that some revolutionaries, specifically the ones calling themselves Marxists, are saying that the Obshina, the rural commune, is bound to dissolve, and that we should just watch it dissolve and then wait for capitalism to develop a proletariat, which then creates the conditions for a socialist revolution. And then there was other socialist, left-wing populists who said that no, that the commune already had a communistic ethos, and that force could be used in the development of socialism. What's interesting is that some years prior, there was a Russian, Mikhailovsky, who wrote an article where he argued that the Marxists in Russia should be very joyful at what capitalism is doing, which was basically at that point the beginning of like a process of enclosure, the kicking of the people from the commons in order to create the sort of laborers that are needed in order to transform them into proletariat, etc. So he says that what the Marxists should be joyful that this is going on, because it merely moves us closer to the beneficial future that they're thinking about. This was one of the more liberal right-wing populists. And Marx drafts a letter reply. He never sends it, but he basically says something very similar to what he says in the Kovalevsky notebook, which is that Mikhailovsky was just taking the comments that Marx made specifically with reference to his studies in Western Europe and just applying them as a universal historical schema in Russia. And so when this letter from Zasulich comes in, he's already kind of rehearsed the process of thinking about these questions. He's already been thinking about it. But nonetheless, he drafts 4 replies, one that's fairly long, and then the rest are a little bit shorter, but the one he ends up sending is a few pages long. And his response is that the Obshina, so the Russian commune, because it has access through markets to the Western world and therefore to capitalism, it has access to the forces of production that capitalism has developed. And if it is able to somehow, he doesn't say how, but if it is able to get a hold of those forces of production, it is very possible that the commune could sustain the relations that it had with more advanced forces of production. In other words, that if the commune dissolves, there was nothing inevitable about it, right? They could have gone another path, which in essence, if you analyze that in the context of his readings of Chernyshevsky, it is him adopting the thesis that Chernyshevsky had. So he sends that letter to Vera Sasulich, and it's very unexpected. It's a very unexpected response, because again, most Marxists held the view that basically Marx and Engels both held for most of their life, that capitalism had to develop everywhere. I mean, he says in the
stop right there. That surprised the heck out of me. And I'm Greg, you probably know about this because you're more of a Marx scholar, but the idea that they wanted capitalism to progress because it had to progress in order to show the problems with it in order to dissolve it. Is that correct? That to me just seems so counterintuitive.
Well, but Pat, I mean, when you say they, who are the they? I mean, that became fashionable at the time of the Second International,
Yeah.
especially with the German Marxist. But that also tied in very closely with their move to revisionism, to opportunism. And so they fit together ideologically. I mean, you have to place it in that framework. So when you say they, let's be clear about who they is. I think it's a little bit of a straw man in that so many people say, aha, later in Marx, we see that Marx is much more flexible. He had a much larger, more all-encompassing view. But of course, I think he always did. I mean, I think he was open to all of this. That's part of the straw man that's been created. We must fight setting up this straw man and then targeting and say, oh, we found in Marx that Marx didn't really believe that. Well, of course he didn't believe that. And I think you look at the rural commune. The rural commune, in fact, 50 years later, when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred after the freeing of the serfs, what was left of whatever was left of that, whatever remnants there were of that sentiment or that thinking or that communalism that you might want to base socialism on was gone.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, when you look at what the Bolsheviks had to do to return and restore a collectivism to the countryside, you throw your hands in the air and say, so what? I mean, really, I don't mean to be, dismissive, but so what? I mean, I think it's a good way of showing that the straw man that's been created about Marx being rigid and being, this is what Marx was, really is just that, a straw man, because he was open to the idea that there were aspects, just as there are today in China. You have remnants of, not remnants of, but you have a big portion of the ideology that the Communist Party keeps alive, and a kind of conflictual relationship with the capitalism that's going on there. And to understand that properly, you have to understand how they interact. And I think that's kind of what you accomplish well in many of your articles when you bring back the infamous dialectic, when you restore things to a dialectical approach. And I applaud you for that.
And that purity article that you wrote of, tell us a little bit about that, about how we are always trying to have this rigidly defined, and if it doesn't fit absolutely everything just perfectly, then we dismiss it. And I think that also goes to, you wrote also when he was corresponding with the Americans, that he did not think that there was one size fits all. He thought that every situation was unique, it should be treated uniquely, and there wasn't this rigid purity, if you would say. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I agree with Greg. There is nowhere in the work of Marx that sort of closed one size fits all approach that is created as a straw man to attack Marxism, right? So the purity fetish, it's an idea that comes from a work that hasn't been translated yet from Domenico Lasorda, which I think for me is perhaps one of the better Marxist-Leninist philosophers that we've had in a while. He just recently passed, but he's got a book called Western Marxism, which I had the chance to read because it was translated in Spanish. And in that book, he develops the idea that what you have in the West is, in Marxist theory specifically, and he's referring to like mostly the folks in academia, not like party theorists, but what you have in the West is a condition where they're able to be very critical and like try to pull apart the assumptions that take place in Marxist theory and other places, but their assumptions are themselves never questioned. And so he traces this thing called a purity fetish, or this obsession with purity, to Christianity. And he ends up saying that this condition that the Western left has, which basically rejects any sort of socialist experiments because it fails to measure up to their mental ideal of what socialism is like, this is rooted in Christianity. And what I have done in my work is try to expand on that and say that although that is correct, it's not rooted in Christianity. Where does its existence in Christianity come from? And so I trace it to the philosophical debates between Parmenides and Heraclitus. And I argue that the Parmenidean conception of truth as that which is one, unchanging, and pure has really dominated. It dominated Greek philosophy, it dominated Roman philosophy, and it got imbued in Christian philosophy. And the paradox is that Western Marxists, who are always wagging their finger at the socialist attempts that have taken place in the third world, who say that that they're dogmatists and mechanical and all these things, which is interesting as a side note because they point to like manuals, which are like just meant to be read by everyday folks, right? But they accuse basically the Soviet tradition of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism in general of being dogmatic and static and metaphysical. But it is them, I argue, that are the ones that are metaphysical when they analyze the world, because they expect socialism to be this pure thing and the socialist construction to be this thing that actualizes itself perfectly from their ideas, and it's the framework of utopian socialism. But anyways, I argue that in line with the sort of Hegelian and the Marxist tradition of dialectics, that there's no such thing that is pure. Everything, in order to exist, in order to be, in order to exist in a process, it has to desecrate its purity. And so socialism, when it is being constructed in a atmosphere of the global dominance of capitalism and imperialism, where there's internal pressures, owning classes, landlord classes, and bourgeoisies that are trying to collaborate with imperialism, it cannot exist with some of the pure ideals that are formulated in what Lenin would call abstract communism, right? It has to desecrate that purity in order to defend the revolution, and that means different things in different places. And in Cuba, it means that after the revolution, the people that were doing terrorist acts and fighting with the Batista dictatorship and defending it, some of those people have to be imprisoned. Others that killed many just innocent peasants just because they gave food to the revolutionaries, others have to be killed. That's and maybe we could think about how things could have been done differently, and we can personally think that we would have done something else. But the wagging of the finger and the ultimate rejection and breaking with socialist projects because of what they did is a complete break with dialectical thinking. It fails to analyze things in their context. It looks at facts and it severs them from the factors of imperialism, pressure, the sort of culture that existed before the socialist revolution in those countries. And what it ultimately boils down to is their application of the metaphysical or dogmatic outlook that they claim to see existing in the places where a socialist revolution has taken place. And what I have called that phenomenon is a purity fetish, right? Because there's an obsession, there's a fetish, a fundamental disconnection between the ideal and reality, and they have fetishized the ideal of socialism. And if they don't see it purely manifested in reality, they ultimately reject it. And that has interesting political implications, because what it does in the West is it legitimizes a sort of left-wing critique of socialism. And that's very effective. And we know from the last 70 years or so that a lot of the funding that has been, a lot of the opposition funding that has been given by the State departments against socialism, whether Soviet socialism or whatever the case may be, has been given to left-wing currents that can critique the Soviet project, Chinese project, or whatever socialist project from the left. And that critique from the left is very effective, because capitalism keeps the vast majority of people in a state of desperation. And ultimately, in certain nodal points, certain moments, when crisis hits, people have this internally accumulated desperation, and they're going to act. And if the left that you create is one which is critical of socialism in other countries, you're creating the conditions so that any sort of uprising is automatically diffused. And I think that as of late, this has somewhat been a stabilizing force for capitalism, right? It's almost like the dictum from the novel The Leopard, right? If you want things to stay the same, they must change. And what you've had is that you've had great mobilizations that come up spontaneously without any organization or revolutionary theory behind them, and then they just diffuse, and people get back to work on Monday, and it stabilizes society. It's almost like a libidinal release, and those conditions I think are tied fundamentally, or what helps that be the sort of state that we're in, which I think with the recent developments of the labor movement, perhaps it's changing, but what helps that exist is a framework from the dominant Marxist currents in the West, which is this purity fetish, which rejects any socialist experiment. And I think there's a certain sense of chauvinism in there, because how are you going to point at everywhere where socialist experiments have attempted to take place and condemn them, but then still say, we, the virtuous West, we're the ones that are going to be able to materialize and actualize socialism. Everything that has taken place before, it's either not socialism or it's, and you start to see these different terms used derogatively, like state capitalism or totalitarianism, dictatorships, and it's very sad. For instance, I was very involved in covering the protests last year in July 11th with Cuba. And one of the interesting things that happened was that there was this one Trotskyist who got arrested for one day by mistake because he just found himself at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was released the next day, but there was this letter that was being sent around that was signed by most academics in the West to release him. And they were calling Cuba an authoritarian government because of that. And the guy had already been released when the letter was being shared. All of that serves to legitimize imperialism. And it comes at specific moments when the revolutions have to be defended, and when people from within the empire who consider themselves anti-imperialist and socialist have to do everything they can to oppose imperialist narratives and to debunk the imperialist propaganda.
So tell me what's going on with Cuba right now with the changes.
Before we go to Cuba, can I just comment on that? I'm compelled to comment on it because I thought it was so good. I mean, I think it's remarkably good, concise, clear, and really to the point explanation of how thinking in this country is shaped and how it's directed in this particular way. I read it in the article that you wrote. I thought was really, really very good. But your explanation today is even better. And, having lived through much of this, I mean, you grow up, for example, I grew up in a working class family. And so I was exposed to somewhat left ideas, and I had some folks in my family that were more left than others. But in the McCarthy era, in which I grew up in, or I come into, you see how these ideas are shaped, how you're directed. If you're a left-oriented person against the Soviet Union, against communism, because they were impure, because they were not the ideal, they did not achieve the kind of purity, as Carlos puts it so well. And so I thought that was an incredibly powerful article that you wrote. And when I think of Western Marxism, I'm thinking generally of academic Marxism, academic Western Marxism. And I think if you go back historically, you deal with it theoretically, you'll find that Western Marxism and its purity grow right alongside of, historically, the development of Leninism. I mean, as Lenin is successful with the Bolshevik Revolution, as Leninism takes roots in various countries and a Leninist party emerges, more and more this purity thing emerges, and academics grab onto it, and they talk about all the flaws, the shortcomings, the unfortunate incidents, the failure to achieve the highest goals of socialism. And we live with that all our lives. And I think if you talk to youngsters that are drawn into some of the left groups today, they're honest and they believe in socialism, but they always have this critique of the Soviet Union. They always have this critique of real existing socialism. they always have this critique of a party, of a vanguard party, and how it's not democratic enough, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted, I didn't want to go on and on about your article, but I really thought that was a superb article, and I think it should be circulated. We should put it on our podcast.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'll link it.
On to Cuba.
Cuba, tell me about Cuba. And I've been following this. There's some changes with, is it Section 43, and the immigration is changing, the way in which the rules are going to be shifting here, and we're going to be seeing a lot more immigrants come in. Is that associated with asylum, the moratorium on the asylum, and now it's being taken away? Anyway, you talk.
I mean, I've heard a little bit about it, but I haven't been following it that closely. As I mentioned, I've been working on a book for the last like 8-9 months, so I've been very hermit mode. But one of the interesting things about immigration, or one of the sad things about immigration, is that Cuba has a law, I forget which one it is, that prevents people to throw themselves in the ocean, right? To come, what in Spanish are called balseros, right? The folks that come on rafts. They have a law against that. And what's usually appealed to in the sort of narrative against Cuba is that law, and the general narrative for why people are not allowed to leave is usually pinned as the Cuban government trying to keep its people in, or it's pinned on Cuba. But the reality is that it's the US, right? The US makes it impossible for people to get visas. And they want to create the conditions for people to throw themselves in the ocean. Why is that? Well, because it creates fantastic atrocity propaganda. It works for the imperialist narrative, right? Cuba doesn't want people that don't want to be there to be there. They're okay with people leaving. It's not Cuba. It's the US that prevents that, so that people throw themselves in the ocean, so that the pictures are captured and the stories are spinned, and the nice romantic music is put in the background. When you spin these stories, you get people's feelings riled up, and then propaganda disseminates itself, and it's effective. So I haven't followed the recent developments, but immigration and there's many thousands of lives that have been lost in the ocean, and it's tragic. But we can't forget that the fault lies on American imperialism, right? The only way that we can forget that is if we treat it as an abstract issue. If we just look at people throwing themselves in the ocean and forget to analyze the context. Again, if we do not understand things dialectically, right? If we do not understand the factors that are behind the fact.
Yeah, I think they're going to be changing, where now they are allowing the visas to Nicaragua, and then from Nicaragua, the Cubans will be coming here. As I understand also, that the policy with the Trump administration was, we are not allowing anybody to come as a refugee, which is an international law. You can't just have one country refuse that. And they changed that and put a moratorium on that. And now that's going to be shifting too. So there's going to be a huge amount of changes with more immigration coming. I was watching Fox News last night, and I think that the Democrats grooming children with critical race theory is going to be replaced by the primal hordes coming to the country, which is sort of what we're seeing in the French election right now. So tell me about the Midwest Marx. That is such a good podcast. Who started that? How's that affiliated? Is it Midwestern Marx? Midwestern Marx, yeah.
Midwestern Marx. I started it with my buddy when we graduated in 2020. We had worked with DSA for basically all of the time that we were in undergrads, and we had quite a few critiques of the dominant left, the DSA left. I know there was a conference in 2019, the Socialist Conference in Chicago. After that happened, we were shocked because the DSA had people on that were promoting regime change against Venezuela, Nicaragua, that were referring to Cuba as a tyrannous as a dictatorship, right? And not in the way that we talk about dictatorship. So I think a week after it came out from the gray zone that some of those people were funded by the NED, which we know is an arm of the CIA and the State Department. But we were very disappointed with that. And along with that, we were noticing that a lot of the things that socialists were primarily concerned with were kind of divorced from the concerns of the general working class. And not that the things were bad, like we supported those things, but there wasn't an emphasis to organize workers, right? And when we looked at the composition of that left, we saw that it's primarily folks in the professional managerial class. That's the sort of term that has emerged. And then besides that anti-imperialist point, the point of organizing workers, we saw that the sort of alternative to that left was this ultra position of people who had almost like internalized the McCarthyite smears of communism as communism as something that wants to like bring death to America. And we were against that. We felt that we feel that there's a strong socialist tradition in the US, a strong abolitionist tradition, feminist worker, anti-racist tradition. And that's part of the American project. We can't like think of that as separated. You know, that's something that results from the internal contradictions of American capitalism and then American imperialism. So we felt that we weren't really comfortable with most of the places that were out. And so we created Midwestern Marx as a website. The person who I created it with, Eddie Smith, he opened up a TikTok and he had been running the TikTok, and for some reason it blew up. We got to close to 400,000 followers, and from that we were shifting, sending people to the website and sending people to the YouTube, and we developed the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which is officially inscribed with an official ISSN number and stuff, and it's the most scholarly part of our project. Now we're opening a print press. We have a few books in line, and it's been unexpected, but we've really enjoyed it, and we've kind of seen perspectives change as we have grown as a project. People don't fall for imperialist propaganda as much as they did when we started. And that's not to say it's us. There's a lot of people doing great work on that, but there's a new focus, I think, in the labor movement. So we've seen a change that we think is generally positive. We've also seen censorship. The TikTok account that we had, close to 400K, it was permanently banned. We created a backup account. It got close to 500,000 followers. That one got banned, and we just created a third one, and it got banned within a day. We were able to get it back, but it's been fun. But the aim of the project is that it's Marxist education news, and we're pretty broad. Although the editors are all Marxist-Leninists involved in different political organizations and parties, we allow for just a general online discourse from the left that seeks to in different ways advance the class struggle, insofar as it's not antagonistic to those central principles, insofar as it doesn't promote a sort of pessimism or pro-imperialist narratives. So yeah, that's
your section on educating Kyle Kulinski to become a Marxist is just, it is the most clever. I should send you these links, Greg. They'll play Kyle Kulinski's, sections, and he's talking about how we need AOC and we need to support Bernie and we need to, and then they'll come in and do a commentary and say, okay, that's fine, but you're missing the real point here. The real point that, you're supporting the imperialist, capitalist foundation of how things are run. You're not questioning that, and you're snipping around the edges, and it's done in a respectful way and in an educational way, very, very educational. Has Kyle ever responded to you yet?
No, he hasn't. He hasn't. I know a lot of people when Eddie does those videos, they'll like tag him on Twitter, but he hasn't responded. I mean, it's the sort of spaces that we had developed in and then developed out of. So if we feel that if we were there once and with studying and practice and engagement with everyday people, both Eddie and I worked with the Bernie campaign in Iowa. So we had to talk to thousands of working folks about socialism, which is something that most people would think is uncomfortable. But once you start talking to working people, I think that if they're open to the discussion, if you're not obnoxious, if you're not condescending, it's the sort of thing that working people understand and that they can get behind. So we felt that if we developed out of it, there's a lot of people that probably can as well. So we promote Marxist and Marxist-Leninist education, and that's one of the ways that we do it.
Yeah.
How do they justify kicking you off TikTok? I mean, what do they tell you that they object to?
So there's different excuses, but the ones that they've been using is bullying, and the other one is promoting harassment. Or so we're not sure whether it's TikTok itself. The thing is that you have in these social media platforms almost like automated algorithms that when something is reported enough, it gets banned. And so, for instance, when we were covering the Cuba situation, we got suspended, which is for 1 week. We got suspended for 1 week, basically the whole summer. So we couldn't cover anything. And it was because we were exposing the lies. We were posting videos from Cuba and we were challenging the imperialist narrative. And the Cubans, the Miami Cubans and stuff were, and the other diasporas were reporting our video. And there's also in social media now ways to get bots to do stuff. And it's been very successful in developing imperialist narratives. We saw that in the protest in Cuba last year. The social media work was absolutely essential in shaping the narrative. You had a bunch of bot accounts that had been made last month, the month before, that were just there sharing a bunch of fake pictures. It was something that actually worked with the Bolivian coup. There was something around, there was something along the lines of 70,000 accounts created for the sake of disseminating this information. Because when you do it successfully, what happens in places like Twitter is that it becomes trending. And when it trends, then more people see it. So you create the bots, they are removed within like a week, but the damage was already done. And it's already from that artificial ground, it was able to create a real ground because it went trending and real people were able to see it. And, the information war is tough. It's tough. And it's specifically tough when the mediums where we have to combat that narrative can so easily take people off who combat it. And I think that right now with the current conflict, whatever opinion you have on it, if you're anything like critical of the dominant mainstream narrative, you're just gone, right? Anything that tries to contextualize the issue, regardless of where you stand on it, is removed, right? And it's very sad, but I've heard people say that, well, what we need to do is create the similar sort of technologically social institutions, like different social media platforms, but just specifically for like left-wing discourse. But I don't know, it's very difficult, and it's a challenge. And I don't think anything replaces just old school organizing in your workplace, organizing in your community. So, yeah.
Yeah, Greg's been writing a lot on his blog about the Ukraine situation and the kind of the mendacity of how we cover things. I don't know if you followed Chomsky lately, Greg, but he had a really nice piece about what was going on in Afghanistan and that we are freezing all of the bank accounts, and there's a chance that hundreds of thousands, if not close to 1 million people will be starving to death because we have frozen all of their assets. based on the premise that at some point in time we might want to come back and get reparations for 9/11 because it started in Afghanistan. The most mendacious, disingenuous, and yet literally no coverage of that. No coverage that our policies are, you know, creating horrible situations. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. Maybe Elon Musk will help us out of all of this.
If you look at the polling around in just in a short time, in 5 years, in terms of attitudes towards China and Russia, it is kind of depressing, because the turnaround in terms of attitudes is just stunning. What the media can do and has done, the mainstream media, you know, the ones that have a free for all, they just turn popular opinion completely around on all this stuff. It's sad, and that's what we face. And like Carlos, I mean, I don't know how we break through that. I mean, I don't know how we get beyond that dominance, but we have to try. And if it's independent platforms, I mean, I'm not capable of doing it, but I hope somebody can figure it out so we can do it, because you know, I think what Carlos has taught me today is that obviously there's an audience. They wouldn't be suppressing it if there wasn't an audience, and a growing audience, and an audience that bodes well for the future. So if you suppress it, you know, it must be there. So we need something to get the word out. We need a megaphone.
Carlos, you are a breath of fresh air. I'm glad I met you. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm going to be stalking you and your work and your academics as you progress. When are you going to have your book done?
I'm hoping to complete it by August. The 2 chapters I have left, they're going to build on stuff that I've already written about in popular outlets, but I want to expand on it, perhaps be less bold with some of the, not the content of the things, but with how I express some things, right? Because I hope to publish it in an academic setting. I have the department here that's going to work with me to hopefully fulfill that end. But yeah, it's I have you guys recently did the interview with Chris Townsend, and it's incredible the sort of organizing efforts that are taking root now in the labor movement. And I forget which one of you two said it, but it was kind of bound to happen, right? And it seems to be happening now. And I think that on one side, the sort of how I have seen people accept the sort of narrative that we have been pushing shows that that people are open to thinking about new ways of doing things. And it's a matter of reaching them. They're going to suppress our ability to reach them, but they can't suppress our ability to talk to our coworkers. They can try.
Right.
They can separate us, put us one day in one corner of the workplace, another one in another, so that we don't have the same people next to us each day. But eventually it'll fall, right?
Right.
or just barbarism, right?
Greg writes for Marxist Leninist Today, and there was Ed Greger, who wrote an article.
Gristar, yeah, Ed
Gristar, about Foster and Foster's book and how important that was for these people organizing, and that was what Chris mentioned also, is the Foster book and how he hands that out like candy wherever he goes to, because it's such a powerful roadmap of how to deal with these things. And so anyway, so you will you'll promise you'll come back when you get your book done and we can chat about it. Okay.
Absolutely. I'm excited. It's been a pleasure talking to you two.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to following you, and keep it up.
Likewise.